My name is Jade Everidge, and I have the honor of introducing our next speaker for this symposium. I'm a communication arts major, and I'm a member of the class of 2018. I am joined by Chase Stowell, who will be moderating the question and answer session after the lecture. Chase is a political science major and a member of the class of 2018. Our next lecture will be presented by Professor Ibram X. Kendi. Professor Kendi is a New York Times best-selling author, an award-winning historian of racism, and professor of history and international relations, as well as founding director of the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University in Washington, D.C. He is the author of the award-winning The Black Campus Movement, and his writing has appeared in Black Perspectives, Salon, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, The Root, and The Atlantic. Before entering academia, he trained and worked as a journalist. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kendi to Linfield.
Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Okay, I just want to see if you still had some energy. I heard Melvin gave a really inspiring, powerful talk, so I'm just hoping to bring it on home a little bit. And it's truly an honor to be here and to be addressing Linfield College, to be addressing the Frederick Douglass Forum. Thank you for organizing this bicentennial symposium on why Douglass matters. You know, it's an honor for me to be here, especially alongside this dynamic slate of speakers, Lee, Diana, David, and of course, Melvin. So I actually sort of helped found the Antiracist Research and Policy Center at American University last year. And one of the things we're doing this year is we're also sort of celebrating the bicentennial of Douglass through what we're calling the FD 200, in which we're sort of recognizing and honoring 200 Americans whose work best represents the legacy of Frederick Douglass. And so Douglass has been on my mind all year long, and I hope to sort of bring these 200 individuals before the nation and the world as really people who are really embodying many of the things that we've been talking about today. And so I was supposed to speak on how to be an anti-racist in conjunction with Douglass's What to the Slave is the 4th of July. But I actually had a little bit of change of heart, if that's okay. And I actually want to speak to you about a lesser known speech that Frederick Douglass gave, and it's anti-racism. I want to talk to you about Douglass, the scholar, the intellectual. And this speech was the first speech Douglass ever gave to a college audience. It was at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland on July 12th, 1854. But before I can sort of talk about this speech and really give its many lessons on anti-racism, of course, there's a backstory to this speech that I want to share. Has anyone, particularly the non-scholars, anybody heard the name Samuel Morton? Samuel Morton. So if you would have been a college student, an intellectual scholar in 1840s, certainly in the 1850s, you would have probably heard the name Samuel Morton. He was probably the most prominent theorist on race in the United States, well-renowned across the Western world. He really sort of his acclaim primarily came from his first major book that was published in 1839 entitled Crania Americana. And in this book, he used his world-famous collection of human skulls that he had measured for their size, skulls that he had sort of categorized by race, skulls that he used to make the case that white people or European people on average had larger skulls than people of African descent. And then he made the intellectual jump to say that those who had the largest skulls, anybody want to take a guess? were the smartest people. And not only did he make that intellectual jump, he also made the case that these skulls and his measurements found and verified that each of the racial groups were separate species of being. In other words, every racial group had its own creation story. And this concept that we can call polygenesis, he really sort of allowed this idea to become the dominant idea in racial science by the time Frederick Douglass addressed this crowd in 1854. This idea that the races were literally biologically distinct and that white people and black people had their own creation stories. And this, as you would imagine, went against biblical teaching. And so many theologians pushed back against this concept because they were saying, well, what about Adam and Eve? I thought we were all descended from one creation, the creation of Adam and Eve. And this concept, which we can call monogenesis, was actually quite popular during the emergence of the United States. And it was really Samuel Morton, particularly in the 1830s, that was able to sort of overtake this dominant racial idea of monogenesis. Now, monogenesis, so you can know, there were people like Samuel Stanhope Smith, who was the longtime president of Princeton University in the late 1700s and early 1800s, who was a monogenesis. Benjamin Rush, who was one of the founding fathers and a very prominent Philadelphia physician. Samuel Bowdoin, anybody heard the name Bowdoin College? He was also a monogenesis. And what these racial thinkers were saying was that we all descended from Adam and Eve. Now, Adam and Eve was white, and the Garden of Eden was in Europe, and the descendants of Adam and Eve, for whatever reason, at some point in time, decided to travel to the south from Europe, and they landed in Africa. And when they got to Africa, the hot sun blackened their beautiful white skins. But because they were originally white, they have the capacity to become white again if they only move to a northern, cooler climate. I just can't make this stuff up. No, this was the dominant theory in early America. And so these racial reformers were urging that the way we solve the Negro problem, which was essentially the existence of black people, was to urge black people to move from Charleston to Boston, from Senegal to London. And literally the climate, the cooler climate will make their skins white again. Now, polygenesis theorists thought this theory of monogenesis was crazy. They stated that no, blackness was actually within the nature of black people. That no, there wasn't this single creation where the descendants of the white descendants of Adam and Eve became black as a result of the climate. No, the original Africans were born in Africa. The original Europeans were born in Europe. The original Asians were born somewhere in Asia. That every race was biologically distinct and it had its own creation story. So it was really Samuel Morton who popularized this theory of polygenesis. To the point, again, it was the most dominant theory before the Civil War, before somebody by the name of Charles Darwin came along and challenged this theory in a book called The Origins of Species. So Samuel Morton had a towering stature among intellectuals in the United States. He had a towering stature among the elite, scientifically inclined defenders of American racism and slavery. The three leading Southern magazines, and again, this was a Northern theorist, the Southern Quarterly Review, the Southern Quarterly, and DeBow's Review were edited by admirers of Samuel Morton, who were firm believers in separate creations. Some of the leading northern newspapers and journals had raved about Morton's work for years and mourned him when he died a few years before Frederick Douglass's speech. And yet, in death, as in life, Samuel Morton had not transcended the academy. So most people who knew about him were people within the academy. So his polygenesis idea had not really been served up in an editable form to the Christian mass of Americans. Someone had to do for Morton what Voltaire had done for Newton, wrote one historian. That monumental task fell to two men who nudged Morton into polygenesis in the first place. One was Josiah C. Nott. Josiah C. Nott was a physician who helped found the University of Alabama Medical School, and in previous decades had been a leading theorist against biracialism. So he, through his work, was making the case that these two separately created biological beings should not be mating, and that in fact, their products will become like mules. They won't be able to reproduce and therefore will lead to the destruction of humanity. And George Glidden, the second author, was probably the most prominent Egyptologist in the United States before the Civil War. He really sort of pioneered the discipline of Egyptology in the United States. Egyptologists now don't like to talk about him, but he probably did. Now, he, of course, was traveling around the country talking about the ancient Europeans as, anybody want to take a guess? White. But he was a very prominent scholar as well. So Nott and Glidden, who were close admirers and friends of Samuel Morton, came together. And as Americans everywhere were reading Uncle Tom's Cabin, these two scholars decided to collaborate on their own grand, hard-hitting work for the general reader. They collected a small library of Egyptology and received from Morton's widow a manuscript he had almost finished. Published in Philadelphia on April 1st, 1853, Nott and Glidden dedicated Types of Mankind, quote, to the memory of Morton. Morton's elegant picture and signature appeared just after the title page. This book slammed, literally, I would argue, onto the country's reading table all of the available evidence proving the races were separately created, were biologically and eternally distinct, and the black species will forever be inferior to the white species. Including some of Morton's unedited manuscripts, Types of Mankind ran almost 800 pages. For visual learners, they inserted a clear illustration of two columns of faces adjoining skulls, the Greek at the top, the ape at the bottom, and the Negro in the middle. The volume is separated into two parts. First, one written primarily by Nott explains the different species of humans, quote, comparative anatomy of the races, hybridization, and geographical distribution. In the second part, Glidden used the latest findings of Egyptology to assail, quote, the biblical dunes in the United States and the Adam and Eve creation story. The volume did not really present anything new. It was as if these two authors had been spent years practicing, gathering their facts, honing their arguments, and now declared their readiness to enter into a competition that had been fought by almost 2 centuries since the founding of the Royal Society in 1660. And really, this competition was really between racist ideas. So in my latest book entitled Stamped from the Beginning, I chronicle this long-standing debate between two kinds of racist ideas. And so one of the ways we can understand these different kinds of racist ideas, both of which expressed black inferiority, was to think about the debate between polygenesis and monogenesis. Polygenesis theorists thought that black people were inferior and were permanently inferior, while monogenesists felt and thought that black people were inferior but temporarily inferior. In other words, they have the capacity to become white. And it is the job of whites to cultivate, to civilize, to develop them into whiteness. While again, polygenesis theorists were like, no, that's impossible. That's wasting your time. And so really this debate between what I call segregationist ideas that have long expressed notions of permanent black inferiority, that have long stated that the reason why we have racial inequities in this society is fundamentally because of black inferiority, and they focused more on killing and incarcerating black people, in contrast to assimilationist ideas, which have stated that black people are not necessarily permanently inferior. They're not necessarily inferior as the result of nature. They're inferior as the result of nurture. And so as a result, they can be civilized and developed. They are culturally and behaviorally inferior, not biologically inferior. And that because we should simultaneously challenge racial discrimination that's harming them, but simultaneously civilize them. And so if we think about this period, there were many abolitionists who believed simultaneously that slavery was wrong and needed to be ended, while also believing that slavery had literally made black people into brutes, into subhumans. And so therefore, the job of the abolitionist was not only to challenge slavery, but also to civilize black people. William Lloyd Garrison, in his preface to Frederick Douglass's narrative, talked about this idea that if we only cultivate the Negro, then everything will be fine, as if Frederick Douglass needed any cultivation, right? So this sort of debate between racist ideas was one in which assimilationists dominated really until the arrival of Morton and Polygenesis and segregationist thought. And so Knott had searched through the annals, according to him, of astronomy, geology, chronology, and geographical distribution of animals, he wrote in the introduction. He found that scientific truth had literally fought its way inch by inch through false theology. The debate, he wrote, over the primitive origin of the races is the last grand battle between science and dogmatism. Who will win? Science must again and finally triumph. So as you would imagine, polygenesis theorists wrap themselves, as racists throughout history have, in objectivity and in science. Before Knott and Glidden had trod gingerly to, quote, to reconcile the plain teachings of science with theological prejudice, in return, their views and motives had been misrepresented, they wrote, and vilified by self-constituted teachers of the Christian religion. We are now done with all of this, Knott made clear in his introduction. We no longer have, quote, any apologies to offer, nor favors to ask. The broad banner of science is herein nailed to the mast. Knott made it seem as if theology rejected separate species, and science accepted separate species. But quite a few theologians were avowed polygenesis, though not nearly as many as the scientists embracing the theory. The virtual consensus in the early 1850s among secular scientists was actually polygenesis, and Knott demanded the same consensus from the church. Only then, he believed, could the dam be obliterated and the theory of polygenesis be released into the mainstream. Types of Mankind sold unbelievably well. The first printing sold out almost instantly. The book was handsomely welcomed in, quote, ethnological and archaeological circle in Europe. Before the century ended, Types of Mankind appeared reappeared again and again, 9 editions in all. An unsigned review appeared in the Sunday edition of the New York Herald, which was the New York Times of that era. The book was worth the tradition established by Morton in the, quote, preeminently American science of ethnology. The authors have written the most remarkable book that has yet appeared in America upon the subject. Multiple human creations was not presented as a hypothesis to be sustained, but as a result which is demonstrated. Science has marched forward, this reviewer argued, not to be slowed by the lions of bigotry, superstition, and ignorance. Types of Mankind was so popular, so deafening, it compelled the first major response to polygenesis by an African American. Reverend Martin B. Anderson, the first president of the University of Rochester, loaned the book to his friend, Frederick Douglass. Anderson also handed over the works of Knott, Glidden, Morton, and some of even the Monogenesis. At Cleveland's Case Western Reserve on July 12, 1854, Douglass mounted a spirited rebuttal. Published that year in Rochester, Douglass recycled the address's messages in speeches for years. Finding a solution to race relations is the moral battlefield that God and country now call the scholars of America, Douglass began. In the eye of both, the neutral scholar is the ignoble man. Scholars who are lukewarm and cowardly will be rejected by earnest men on either side of the controversy. And so the reason why I sort of begin with this is really one of the earliest sort of lessons that I realized in writing about this long-standing debate between racist ideas and anti-racist ideas is that we have long believed that there's some sort of neutrality, that there's some sort of middle ground. This sort of middle ground we now call not racism. Anybody know what I'm talking about? So somebody says something or does something that we consider to be racist, their response is, I'm not racist. Anybody, I mean, I live next to a person who says, I'm the least racist person you've ever met. I'm the least racist person you've ever interviewed. I'm the least racist person you fill in the blank. Donald Trump has probably said it. But it's indicative of this idea that there's this categorical, philosophical, or even historical category of not racism. What is a not racist? Anybody know? I've been looking for like what that really is. And so really there's only 2 sides to this controversy. The racist perspective and the anti-racist perspective. The racist perspective states that the inequalities that surround us are the result of the inferiority of particular racial groups. The anti-racist perspective states that the inequality that surrounds us is the result of racial discrimination. Now, you have some who try to claim both, who state somehow it's both, but fundamentally, there's 2 sides to this controversy. But of course, we've had a lot of scholars, as Douglass challenged, that have tried to sort of stay out of the controversy and tried to sort of stand in this non-existent neutrality. In the speech titled, The Claims of the Negro, Ethnologically Considered, Douglass stated, common sense itself is scarcely needed to detect the absence of manhood in a monkey or to recognize its presence in a Negro. And I should state that, as I mentioned earlier, with the visual sort of, with the picture that came with Types of Mankind that had the sort of most superior white person, which according to them were the Greeks, and then you had the Negro, and then you had the ape. That historically, when we think of this sort of racial hierarchy, we've typically thought sort of white over black, to quote a famous title of a book, when in fact, a third sort of category in that hierarchy that is crucial is the category of animals. So in other words, black people historically have not just been, it has not just been stated that black people are inferior to white people, it has also been stated that black people are like animals. And that is how, historically, you can make the case that black people are simultaneously intellectually inferior and physically superior. In other words, the most intellectually superior beings on earth are white people. The most physically superior beings on earth are animals. And so therefore, if black people are close to animals, then that explains why they're by nature more athletic. That explains why they're by nature great dancers. All of these apparently physical sort of traits, we've rendered traits of the Negro. So continuing with Douglass, away therefore, with all that scientific moonshine, Douglass using the term moonshine, that would connect men with monkeys, that would have the world believe that humanity, instead of resting on its characteristic pedestal, gloriously independent, is a sort of sliding scale, making one extreme brother to the orangutan and the other to angles and all the rest intermediaries. This argument derives, he argued, from this old question. It is the question whether the rights, privileges, and immunities enjoyed by some ought not to be shared and enjoyed by all. As we are all from one human creation, he argued, we should all share and enjoy it all. But nearly all advocates, Douglass proclaimed, nearly all advocates of polygenesis, quote, hold it to be the privilege of the Anglo-Saxon to enslave and oppress the African. When men, Douglass wrote, oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. Let me state that again. When men, Douglass stated, oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. When I first read this sentence in researching for Stamp from the beginning, and even reflecting on it, I realized that I wrote a 500-page book that Douglass stated in one sentence. I mean, this is essentially what I used 500 pages to state, that when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. And this idea is fundamental to the thesis that I presented in Stamp from the Beginning. And I think one of the key words in Douglass's sentence is justification. And the reason why it's key, because in writing this history of racist ideas, I wanted to inquire and investigate as to whether what we have been taught is the sort of origin story of racist ideas is true. What I mean by that is we have been popularly taught that the origins historically of racist ideas is ignorance and hate. And those who have expressed racist ideas have expressed them because they were ignorant and hateful. I should say produced them because they were ignorant and hateful. And it was these people who had these racist ideas. These are the people who have instituted racist policies because of these racist ideas. So in other words, we've been taught this sort of relationship of ignorance and hate leading to racist ideas, and racist ideas leading to racist policies, which is why historically racial reformers have put so much emphasis on education and love because they viewed ignorance and hate as the central force of the racial problem, right? And so if you believe that racist policies are coming out of racist ideas and racist ideas are coming out of ignorance and hate, and you want to get rid of those ideas and policies, what are you going to focus on? The ignorance and hate. So I wanted to sort of investigate this. In writing this history of racist ideas, were the producers of racist ideas producing these ideas because they were ignorant or hateful? And I say producers because I wanted to distinguish, I ended up distinguishing the producers from the consumers. So I wanted to write a book chronicling not the people who read Types of Mankind, but trying to understand Josiah C. Nott. I wanted to understand not the people listening to the theologians, not the people who are listening to the pro-slavery theorists of some of the most prominent slaveholders, not the people who are listening to the political speeches. I wanted to understand why these politicians, these novelists, these scholars, these theologians, these filmmakers were producing these ideas that, of course, people like Douglass had to spend his whole life challenging. Why? And I found in studying them, in studying their motives, in placing the production of those ideas, those new ideas in particular, within the context of their historical moment, I found that many of these individuals were not ignorant and actually historically have been rendered the most brilliant American minds, and that many of them didn't even hate black people. I recently gave a talk in Charlottesville, and they know a little bit about that. If y'all know what I'm talking about. Charlottesville, Virginia, right? And so I found that these people were typically producing new racist ideas to substantiate new or existing racist policies. That racist ideas were a justification for the policies. That racist ideas were utilized to normalize the racial inequities that came about as a result of those policies. And that people were instituting racist policies principally out of cultural, political, and economic self-interest. In other words, I'm enslaving black people because I want to make money. I'm disenfranchising black people because I want to get into or stay in office. And so really, I found that it wasn't ignorance and hate leading to racist ideas and racist ideas leading to racist policies. Through studying these producers of racist ideas, through learning from people like Frederick Douglass, I realized that it was actually quite the opposite. That racist policies were leading to racist ideas, that people consuming racist ideas were causing them to become ignorant and hateful. And so that then changes the calculus, of course, of how we challenge racist ideas, or even how we challenge racist policies. Because if the cradle is not ignorance and hate, but the cradle is self-interest, then we begin to see why Frederick Douglass continues to say and continues to sort of echo through the generation that power concedes nothing without demand. It never has, and it never will. That fundamentally, the racial struggle is a power struggle. And anti-racists, historically, have been engaged in this power struggle to challenge racist policies, whether those racist policies are slaveholding, segregation, impoverishing policies, mass incarcerating, mass deporting policies, that fundamentally, the anti-racist is on the front line of challenging racist policies and challenging the power behind those policies and recognizing that the power will not change without demand, or that another more effective way is to literally get into a position of power. And so I think when we look at the course of Frederick Douglass's life, that's why the longer he lived, the more powerful positions he accumulated, because he recognized the role of power in shaping the racial course of America. And so I think I wanted to sort of come and speak to you about this sort of idea: when men oppress their fellow men, the oppressor ever finds in the character of the oppressed a full justification for his oppression. And again, we can see Douglass's ideas still percolating today. What is the justification for voter ID laws? Voter fraud, fraudulent black people. What is the justification for deporting policies? Because apparently the people who are coming are criminals and rapists, right? What is the justification for the tough on crime policies? Well, these people are like super predators and brutes. And so we can't rehabilitate them. We literally have to incarcerate them by the millions. The younger, the better. Fundamentally, because what happens, I think, is that when you believe these justifications that ultimately serve to oppress people, you're not able to see the racist policies, because you believe that these people should be deported, that they should be incarcerated, that there should be ways in which these people should be blocked from voting. So we don't even see, let alone challenge, let alone demand of power to change. And so I think fundamentally, that is the reason why it's critical to develop an anti-racist perspective. An anti-racist perspective that recognizes the racial groups as equal, and in recognizing those racial groups as equal, recognizing that racial inequities are abnormal between equal groups, and in that abnormality, what must be causing it is some sort of racist policy that we can or cannot see, and therefore the job of the anti-racist becomes to challenge those policies and to recognize, again, that power concedes nothing without demand. Thank you.
I hope this is on. All right. Thank you, Professor Kendi. And my name is Chase Stoll, and I will moderate the coming question and answer session. So please raise your hand if you have a question or a comment, and we will get to you as soon as possible.
Professor, I'd like to suggest an alternative interpretation for that quote from Frederick Douglass. I'm paraphrasing, that the oppressor finds justification in the oppression. It was very common around in the 1850s for Republicans and free soil advocates, anti-slavery advocates, to defend against the charge that, that slaves were inferior, to talk about the effect of slavery on people. Mm-hmm. And that if you put any human being of whatever their origin goes into that condition, that it just does so much damage to the human person that would end up serving as justification for further oppression. They would quote Homer and say that slavery takes half the man away. Benjamin Franklin in the first Congress, when he authored a petition to stop slavery, he wrote a satiric piece which reversed the colors and used the speech of the representative from I don't want to make a speech, but he did the same thing. He reversed the colors and showed that if If you put a white person into Moorish slavery, you'll see the same effects and so on. And I wonder if that's what Douglass was doing when he gives that quote. It's a way to say, look, if they've, that's the effect of that terrible practice.
So, I mean, he could have been. I mean, I think as an historian or scholar, I can't really read Douglass's mind and his intention behind that. One thing I will say is that you're absolutely correct about the way in which the captive was framed. And in Stand from the Beginning, I actually make the case that this theory that abolitionists put forth, that free soilers, as you stated, and Republicans writ large put forth, though it was viewed as a progressive theory, and though the people who were articulating it were well-meaning, that the theory itself, that the ideas itself were racist ideas. That they were making the case that slavery, as I think I stated briefly in the talk, and the dehumanizing conditions of slavery was literally dehumanizing black people. And of course, this theory that I call in my work the oppression inferiority thesis continued after the end of slavery. And it would be articulated during the segregationist era. In other words, the confining sort of aspects of segregation was causing an inferior culture and character within the Negro. It then continued, and to this day, in the concept of poverty, that black people are disproportionately poor. And so therefore, apparently, poor people, middle-income people, say, have this sort of cycle of impoverished values that they pass on that are inferior and defective. And since black people are disproportionately poor, they're disproportionately sort of passing on these inferior character traits. The problem with this thesis is that it first and foremost, as everybody would understand, connotes this black inferiority. But instead of stating that the black inferiority is rooted in biology or culture, it states the inferiority is rooted in the oppressive environment. What's interesting is those who sort of study these people, whether enslaved people, segregated people, or even impoverished people, the first thing I think we realize is typically elites standardize their character and culture and then apply that to poor people, or apply that to segregated people, or apply that to enslaved people and say, since you're not dressing and talking and thinking like I am, that the way you're thinking and talking and dressing is inferior. When in fact, that's fundamentally subjective. We also know that African American culture, in many things that people still praise African Americans from a cultural perspective, found its origin in this apparently dehumanizing environment of slavery, which is an ironic sort of contradiction. We can't on the one hand say that there are all these great things that African Americans sort of brought to the United States, then also state that slavery dehumanized them, recognize that many of those things found their origins in slavery, but then still state that these people were subhuman. You see the way that sort of works. I mean, either we recognize that an oppressive, dehumanizing environment doesn't necessarily dehumanize people. In other words, it's one thing to say an environment is dehumanizing. It's yet another thing to say it did dehumanize. That those things that you literally, there's something called resistance that people can simply consistently do to maintain their humanity despite the conditions. And I would argue that people across the world, whether people who were suffering Nazi oppression or enslaving oppression, still were able to maintain their humanity and build human products.
Okay. Thank you so much for the talk, Professor Kendi. My question dealt with the polygenesis theory, and I want to know if you had some thought, not some thoughts, but some further explanations about the different origin stories that they had for each of the individual races. I don't know if...
So I'd say most polygenesists had a different theory. And I remember Lord Keynes, who was a Scottish Enlightenment thinker, wrote this book, I believe in 1774, in which he used the Tower of Babel story from the Bible. Anybody familiar with the Tower of Babel story from the Bible to sort of explain the origin story of these different species? Others who believed in the curse of Ham would use that theory. And again, I'm expressing when these theorists were trying to square, quote, science, which to them was polygenesis, with the dominant theology. And so there were a series of different sort of theories. Probably the most popular one, though, and this theory really continued into the 20th century, was this idea that black people were created before Adam and Eve with the animals. And actually, this theory was so prominent that Jefferson Davis, on April 12, 1860, expressed this theory on the floor of the US Senate. In opposing a bill that would have provided funding, public funding to educate black people in DC, he opposed that bill and stated that the inequality between the white and black races was stamped from the beginning. And then he proceeded to explain why. That Cain, when he was excommunicated from the Garden of Eden, went, according to Jefferson Davis, to the land of Nod. And in this land of Nod, the world's first criminal not only encountered animals, but also encountered the species that was created alongside animals, black people. And so he was saying this to his colleagues in the US Senate. No, I can't make this stuff up either, sorry.
Well, thank you. I thought your chapters on Garrison were fascinating, and I wanted to ask you, talk a little bit more about Douglass's break from the Garrisonians and the way he, could we say, to redefine the Constitution from a racist tool to an anti-racist tool.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I didn't really get into that as much, I think, because that's more on political theory in the text, but certainly by the 1850s, especially Garrisonians, as you call them, had made the case that the Constitution was fundamentally, of course, a racist document, a slavery and enslaving document, and so therefore they were not seeking to abide by that. While Douglass made the case that the Constitution, and more specifically the Declaration of Independence, and its idea of creation, equal creation, all men being created equal, was actually a progressive sort of anti-racist idea. He also, of course, started to recognize the role that politics played and power played in changing the racial course of America. So while Garrisonians were more similar to sort of the sort of Martin Luther King perspective of, we really need to touch the conscience, and I should say pre-1964 King, the conscience sort of Americans, and we need to recognize, they need to recognize through our teaching that slavery is wrong, and then we can then go about ending slavery. Of course, Douglass and others were like, no, we don't have time for all of that. Even though he, of course, spent the better part of his life before the Civil War trying to sort of do that. But he also, of course, tried to organize and challenge racist and enslaving power, or what Garrison called the slave power. They also broke on some level on issues of black nationalism, or more specifically on issues over who should be at the forefront of challenging slavery. Should the white abolitionist or the former slave, right? And there's that famous, of course, article that Garrison writes in which he states that no, we actually, white abolitionists, are better equipped to do this than people like Douglass, which of course Douglass did not take too kindly from. And of course that sort of led to one of the things that led to their split.
Hi. Okay, I should have written this question down, but I'm going to figure it out. Okay, so you talked about justification, the oppressor and the oppressed. And for contemporary, so I want to talk about contemporary times, and I'm going to make a couple people mad. I already know that.
Oh, there's nothing wrong with that. I've made a lot of people mad.
So today there's a lot of famous people who are getting in kind of hot water with minority groups, including Kanye West and Chance the Rapper. Chance the Rapper recently posted on Twitter that it's not wrong for black people to be Republicans, right? And a lot of people are criticizing these comments and the things that Kanye West has been posting and saying that they are promoting anti-blackness, anti-Latino, anti-Asian, anti-women. They're supporting somebody that is using this kind of rhetoric. And so what role do minorities that support these types of justifications play in anti-blackness and anti-other things?
So, I mean, I think certainly you have black people who are walking around with their Make America Great Again hats, like Kanye, who feel reinforced in their views, or even Latinos and Asians and other communities of color. But I think, and so celebrities like Kanye and others are able to sort of reinforce what these people already believe, just like they at times challenge what they believe. But I think, I don't think we should necessarily overstate what happened with Kanye West. And so it seems to me, and this, of course, I'm speculating, that Kanye West is brilliant at getting attention, especially when there's an album coming out. And I suspect that's precisely what he was seeking to do. And I suspect Chance the Rapper, who's very close to Kanye, did not want to slam his friend in public. So he simply sort of figured out a way to sort of back him up. And so that's what I suspect sort of happened. But personally, I do not rely on celebrities, or I should say more specifically musicians or rappers, to engage the country in racial ideas. Now, of course, we have the media wanting to go to every black person to ask them about race as if they're expert because they're black. But that doesn't necessarily mean we have to, of course, treat their ideas as if it's coming from somebody who is knowledgeable. Kanye is a brilliant producer and rapper, period. He's not, certainly some of his earlier work had social commentary in it, but that's really what he is. And I think the bigger problem is the fact that we give these people platforms to engage in racial discussions or even political discussions that they're not really necessarily knowledgeable about, or we make it seem as if it's more than it really is. In other words, Kanye, like his wife, seeking to get attention.
I think I've got the mic.
Yes.
Yeah, I thought you did a wonderful job showing how these racist ideas emerge as justification for already existing oppressive practices. I found that very persuasive. So what you describe is a rationalization of oppression or an ideologization of oppression. And I wonder if after that happens, does that change the priorities for someone who is anti-racist? So, why does Douglass give this speech? The speech is called The Claims of the Negro Ethnologically Considered. Does he now believe that because of the advent of ideologized oppression that you have to strike down that ideology? You have to fight these perverse pseudoscientific ideas with another set of ideas? Or is his primary activity still just resistance to the oppressive practices? Mm-hmm. So in a way, it seemed to me where you ended up was actually saying there's a reason why most people don't read that speech anymore. That's not really where the locus of his political activism is.
Well, actually, to your fundamental question, I would say he's probably doing both at this period based on his record. And I don't necessarily think that is a problem. because if we, of course, think about the producers of racist ideas versus the consumers, we begin to see that the producers, if they're producing those ideas out of seeking to justify a racist policy that comes out of their own self-interest, that it's really difficult for us to persuade or educate them away from that idea, that they may already be knowledgeable is ignorant, versus the consumer of those ideas, who we actually can educate away from those ideas, because their belief in those ideas, even though they're led to believe that it's in their self-interest by particularly the most persuasive racist ideas, it fundamentally is not. And so I think historically, we have been effective, people like Frederick Douglass have been effective in persuading away the racist ideas of the consumers. Of course, we have also tried to persuade away the racist or educate away the racist ideas of producers, and that's where we failed. And I think I was trying to sort of explain why we have failed. Now, those producers are typically the ones with power, and they're typically the ones that have the ability to change policy. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't mobilize the consumers to demand power change, which is precisely what I think Douglass and others were seeking to do. And to your last point about sort of why this speech is not as well known, you know, the conspiracy theorist in me would say that Americans do not want to remember how prominent the theory of polygenesis was. Because it really, in order to talk about this speech, you have to understand what he was challenging, right? And it's almost as if we even look in many of the disciplines, like anthropology and others, they don't talk about these polygenesis theorists who founded them. You know, we want to believe that other people were more prominent, and we've sort of almost erased this period of time in racial thought, because as each of you would imagine, these ideas are so ridiculous. But I think that's probably one of the reasons why this speech isn't talked about more, because we just don't talk about polygenesis.
Am I going? Okay. Hi. Thank you so much, Professor Kennedy, and everyone who spoke today. Nick Bucola, who is somewhere on that side of the room, is teaching a class this semester on Baldwin and Douglass in conversation with one another. And I'm not in that class, but I was here 3 years ago when we had a symposium celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the debate between Buckley and Baldwin in the UK. And one of the comments that was raised at that event was on Baldwin talking about slavery as being a negative system because of the moral atrophy which it imposes upon the slaveholder. And that seems to me to have a lot to do with this quote of Douglass's that you raised, and I wondered if you could speak to a minute to the relationship between those two, or if I'm just imagining things.
Well, I mean, I think Douglass, in his speaking and writing on slavery, has made a similar case in which slavery has, of course, led to a sort of common immorality, you know, among the slaveholding class. That's certainly something that Douglass was speaking about, and abolitionists more broadly were agreeing. Black and white abolitionists, you know, really no matter their ideology, were typically agreeing on that very idea. And so, of course, Douglass was as well.
Hi, over here.
Hey.
So you said as I hopefully recall earlier, that to become an anti-racist, you must take a stand against racist policies which generate racist ideas. Am I correct there? Or
Somewhat, but yes, you can continue.
all right, but I want to talk about someone who, while at the same time opposes these racist policies, do not see any racial element to these policies or ideas. What would you describe? I mean, how would you describe these people?
It's racist. Because what happens is And, you know, this isn't necessarily describing them. They're more or less not only victimizers based on their ideas, but they're also victims, because what racist ideas do is it causes us to not see racial elements behind the disproportionate incarceration of black people. That no, it's not because they're black, it's because they're criminal-like. You know, that is precisely what racist ideas do. And that is what racist ideas historically have done. Really, every racist idea is like a post-racial idea. What it essentially does is it causes us to not see race and instead see the inferiority of a particular, I should say, racist policies, and not see the inferiority of a particular group. And then it simultaneously causes us to deny those very ideas that are blinding us to those policies. And then we, of course, see the inequities, but because we can't see the policies, we blame those inequities not on race, but on some other thing like the inferiority of a particular group, class, some other sort of category. And so that's what they are. Now, I should say that one of the things that I'm seeking to do in my work on anti-racism or on an anti-racist is to, instead of us sort of thinking about becoming an anti-racist, we think about being an anti-racist. And the distinction is that an anti-racist, like a racist, is not a fixed category. In other words, an anti-racist, like a racist, is that based on not who they are, but what they're saying and what they're doing or even not doing. And I think one of the reasons why people shy away from the category or even the category of racist is because they view it as an identity that they could never shed. They also, I think, we don't recognize, and I tried to sort of chronicle this in Stand from the Beginning, the way in which individuals in the same speech, in the same book, will say both racist and anti-racist ideas. So then how do we categorize that person or even that speech if they've expressed both ideas of racial hierarchy and ideas of racial equality? I mean, I argue in the text that Du Bois's double consciousness was a double consciousness of assimilationist and anti-racist ideas. And that fundamentally this double consciousness has persisted prominently within the black community, let alone other communities. This sort of fundamental contradiction of standardizing whiteness and trying to be white while simultaneously having a pride in blackness, even though that's in deep contradiction. And so, you know, I'm saying this to say that it's for us to not think of becoming, it's really, what are you saying? Are you expressing hierarchy or equality? Are you challenging racist policies? Or are you allowing those racist policies to maintain by your support of them or even your inaction?
Sir. Tremendous symposium today. I have a question regarding the nature of the oppressor overthrowing the oppressed, or the oppressed, by justification, overthrowing the oppressor. In the notion of, say, Frantz Fanon and his tremendous tome, The Wretched of the Earth, where he spoke of the justification for violently overthrowing the oppressor. Do you ever envision a time or a place or a culture where that would be a necessity and where that could actually legitimately take place?
You mean sort of a violent campaign to overtake the...
Whether you envision there ever being a justification or that ever actually taking place.
So using violence?
Yes,
okay.
For the oppressed to overthrow the oppressor.
So I mean, the Haitian Revolution is, I think, a great example of a group of oppressed people using violence and their military right to defeat not only the local armed group of white enslavers, but then to defeat the British, Spanish, and French armies in succession to win and then maintain their freedom. Of course, the Cuban Revolution, I think, is another example of a group of people who used violence. And so, you know, I think that has happened previously, and it's happened in other parts of the world, just like there's been other parts of the world that did not need to resort to violent sort of action in order to throw off the yoke of oppression. But I could imagine that there was probably no way in which the most profitable slaveholding colony in the world, as Haiti was at the time, at the start of the Haitian Revolution, that the slave owners who made and reaped the benefit of those profits were simply going to hand those profits over, particularly in an institution based fundamentally on violence. And so I think violence has certainly been used. I also think that we spend too much time sort of debating the merits of violence versus nonviolence, which primarily seems to me to be more of a liberal sort of engagement, in that we're so concerned with the means as opposed to the end. And that's why you had people who've challenged those sort of liberal ideas, most notably Malcolm X, who would say things like what? By any means necessary, right? And of course, he was challenging those who were so concerned with the means. But then those who make the case for the means state that how do you create a nonviolent society through violence? What they would say, right? And so, it's certainly a debate that we've been having, but I think people have used violence to throw off that yoke. Yes.
Ibram, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I have a question sort of asking you to tie together the 4th of July speech with the claims of the Negro. So 2 years apart, almost exactly. And I want to connect it to the quote that many of my students who are in the class they now have their own Frederick Douglass T-shirts with "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And I wonder if you can tell us what you think the demand ought to look like. Because one of the most striking things about looking at the two speeches next to each other is that in the 4th of July speech, there is this moment when he says, where all is plain, there's nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man, right? And then he goes on a few minutes later to say, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. A fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke, right? And yet 2 years later, here he is giving this very kind of systematic academic speech. And I just wonder, the historical story there is interesting, but I wonder just in terms of your sense of in terms of actually moving an anti-racist agenda forward, what the demand ought to look like. Does when you think about the rational argument versus other forms of moving people from what Douglass called the downy seat of inaction.
Yeah, so I think that I agree with Douglass's. If you're asking me my perspective, not Douglass's.
Well, maybe both.
Okay. Well, Douglass's perspective, and I think he stated this in both speeches. And I think I quoted some of this in my presentation, that we should not even be arguing this. He was making the case in both speeches. And he made the case that the fact that we are even discussing this is crazy. And so what that ultimately means is that he was not he recognized that this debate was going on, but he simultaneously hated that this debate was going on, and when he would engage in the debate would say, I should not even be engaged in this debate. And so ultimately, I think what he would have preferred, and what I would agree with, is instead of engaging in this debate over the equality of the races, instead we're engaged in a debate on how to undermine racist policies, on how to create equal opportunity, on how to eliminate racial disparities. That is the debate, because it is the debate. There are different ways in which you can sort of go about doing that. And I think that idea from Douglass and others throughout history is something that I think is very dear to me, and I think that's why even the center that I helped found is fundamentally focused on the policy engagement and the power engagement, as opposed to the ideological engagement. Now, that's not to say we're not going to do some work on trying to sort of educate away the racist ideas of the consumers, but that's more of a secondary operation than the fundamental focus on policies and power.
Right.
Yes.
You kind of hit on what I was about to say just now, but your speech really spoke to me because, I mean, I lived in my whole life, I always lived in very, like, white populated places. And even my history teacher, like, we learned about the schools that you were talking about. And I didn't really think much of it. And, like, I definitely am one where I had fallen into, like, being like, oh, like, African-American people are really good at sports. And, like, I know this is wrong. Obviously, like, now I know this is totally wrong because that's just the culture I grew up in, and that's what people told me. And I didn't even realize that what I was thinking was offensive. And so I, like, how would you, I guess, stray away from these thoughts and, like, be productive but not offensive in letting people know that in these simple ways that they were brought into the world, like, they're wrong, I guess.
So I'm always reminded of one of Malcolm X's most riveting speeches to black people, in which he stated, "Who taught you to hate yourself?" And so if we're sort of reworking this for white people, who taught you to hate black people? And for what reason? What purpose? And so I think your question was sort of two parts. How do I as an individual sort of stray away from these ideas? And then how do I teach others to sort of stray away from these ideas? I think as it relates to the individual, I think instead of striving to not be racist, which I don't even know what that is, instead striving to recognize the biological, cultural, and behavioral equality of the racial groups. And so biological equality, recognizing that science has spoken. There's no such thing as black people or white people from a genetic perspective. And if anything, geneticists have found that there's more genetic diversity within Africa than between Africa and the rest of the world. In other words, people in Western Africa are more genetically similar to people in Western Europe than they are to people in East Africa, which of course seems crazy when we look at the way they, quote, look, right? But, and then recognizing that there are many different cultures around the world, and that instead of us judging those other cultures from our own cultural standards, instead saying, you know, I enjoy my culture, that culture is different, and I'm gonna level all of these different cultures. And then finally, I think behavioral inferiority, which I think is the most difficult for people to sort of get rid of, that really, when you say something like a particular group is more lazy or criminal-like than another group, we can't say that based on an individual or a series of individuals that we've encountered. In other words, yeah, black students are lazy because I'm engaged with one lazy black student. So all black students across the country or across the college are lazy. We generalize individual black negativity, which then reinforces our ideas about those generalized black negative behavioral characteristics. But you know, I think for us to, again, recognize that even the behaviors, no one has ever proven any of them. I mean, we've made a lot of different cases. To give one example, I want to preview a piece that I'm about to publish in The Atlantic, so don't get me in trouble and tell them. So one of the most prominent, a prominent idea about black people is that there's this sort of no snitching black culture. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Yeah. That in the black community, there's this no snitching culture that's apparently worse than in any other community. But when you actually look at the statistics, we actually find that black people report crime just as much as other racial groups. That if anything, the group that is the least likely to report violent and serious crime are white people. That's when you actually look at the statistics. But of course, you have a law enforcement community with declining clearance rates, meaning rates in which they actually, people of course report violent crime and it leads to arrest. And instead of looking within themselves, who are they gonna blame? Oh, the reason why that's happening is because these people won't snitch, right? Even though that does not, and then people believe that. And most people, even within the black community, believe that. Even though those statistics show otherwise. And so I think for us to look for statistics when we make a generalization. Behavioral statistics when we make a behavioral generalization, and so on and so forth. And then finally, very quickly, in terms of the minds of others, I think we should distinguish between closed-minded and open-minded people. I think we should focus our efforts on open-minded people. Now, some of those closed-minded people may be our loved ones, so I think that's a different story. And then with those open-minded people, I think the discussion we need to have is what is a racist idea? What is a racist policy? Because I think many people believe and express racist ideas, but refuse to classify those ideas as racist. So what I then do is, before I even have a discussion with these people, I'm like, let's define a racist idea. And do you agree to hold to that definition when we start talking about race? Because of course you have to say that, right? Because then people want to change the definition based on whatever they're talking about, because they constantly want to define their ideas outside of racism. They constantly want to define their policies outside of racism. And that's the history of racism in and of itself. And so we have to then lay down that definition before we can engage in those conversations.
All right, we have time for one more question. Last question of the day. This gentleman here in the front.
You mentioned Cuba as one of the instances in which revolutionary violence might have been justified. Did you mean Cuba in the last few years of the 19th century, or did you mean Cuba in the late 1950s? Which revolution were you talking about?
I was talking about in the late 1950s.
How could you defend the violence by communists in Cuba, which led to the kind of tyranny and oppression there that caused thousands and thousands of people to risk their lives to leave that island, and still causes trouble in Latin America and other places like Venezuela?
So, first off, I think it's one thing to say that a particular group viewed themselves as oppressed and used violent revolutionary sort of action to lift themselves from the yoke of oppression. It's yet another thing to say that they were justified in doing so. And so I brought up Cuba as an example of a group of people who recognized that they were oppressed and used revolutionary violence to challenge that oppression. Now, on the other hand, in terms of this idea in which it was just this sort of one-sided scenario in which the communists were the violent violators, and they were in no way justified in that violence, we really have to sort of think about, and we really have to debate that. I think one of the most egregious things I think you're talking about is after the revolution, they had these sort of firing sort of ranges in which they really shot and killed people who were opposed to the revolution, who had been mass exploiting Cuban people for decades. And the question was, what do we do with these people? And so Che Guevara and others made the case, we need to kill them, while others were like, no, let's spare them. But then those who were like, okay, let's spare them was, okay, if they're spared and they remain on the island, then will they be able to overtake the revolution? And so that was a debate within the people. And I think we can argue from a moralistic standpoint that they should not have done that, and they should have allowed those people to remain with their land, with their resources, and just hope that they didn't retake the island and then gain the sort of allegiances of the U.S. to then allow the U.S. to continue to use Havana and Cuba as another Las Vegas, or, we can debate that. I know as an African American, the role that Cuban revolutionaries and leaders played in the Pan-African struggle against colonization, in which they were very critical. And so I don't think it's a one-sided sort of thing in the late 50s and early 1960s, but I didn't really come here to talk about Cuba, did I? But I just think it's a lot more sort of complex than the way you laid it out, or even this idea that I was arguing that their violence, no matter what they did, was justified, because I don't agree with that. I'll stop there.
But yeah, before we, so I'm going to ask you in a minute to join me in thanking Professor Kendi, but before I do that, I want to make sure you stay in your seats for just a couple more minutes after we thank him, because you've heard from 11 of 12 students in the Douglas Baldwin seminar, and Amelia has a farewell comment to make, and I want to make sure she's included. But please join me in thanking Ibram Kendi for his wonderful lecture. And while Amelia is making her way up to the lectern, I just want to add my thanks to all of you for being here. Many of you have been here all day. I want to thank the Nicholson Library staff for I was a little concerned. I mean, Bahram told me yesterday, he says, we don't worry about, the library being too busy on a Friday. It makes me wonder about my students. Why aren't they here? But this has really been a dream come true for me to devote a day to talking about Frederick Douglass, and I had very high expectations, but the scholars have exceeded my expectations, and the audience questions have also been terrific, so I really appreciate it. Amelia.
Hello, my name is Amelia Warnock. I'm a sophomore and political science major here at Linfield, and on behalf of Professor Bucola's Baldwin and Douglas class, and on behalf of the larger Linfield community, I really would like to express gratitude to Lee Fott, David Blight, Melvin Rogers, Ibram Kendi, and Diana Schwab. We are so fortunate to have the expert academics of Douglas take time out of their schedule and visit our small college on the 200th anniversary honoring Douglas's birth. I would also like to extend thanks to everyone who could make this event possible. Thank you, Professor Bucola. Thanks to the Elliot Alexander Fund and to the Jack Miller Center, and thanks, of course, to all of you for coming.